to the talk. And thank you, Samantha, for recording this. I think I will just turn it over to Dawn White, who is going to explain what we're going to be talking about or hearing today.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome, Chris. I have the pleasure today, you don't have to do that. I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Christopher Shortell, who actually is no stranger to RAPS. We've heard from him a couple of times before, and he did such a wonderful job for us that, well, we keep asking him back. Chris is going to talk to us today on the topic post-Trump America. Where does American politics go from here? Before we turn the mic, so to speak, over to Chris, let me tell you a little bit about him. He came to Portland State from the University of California in San Diego, where he earned his PhD. He's an associate professor of political science in the Hatfield School of Government. He arrived on our campus in 2008, which, come to think of it, is the year I retired. And since his time at Portland State, he has served as department chair. His research deals with the relationship between law and the broader political system, with a particular focus on the interactions between law and society, law and elections, and federalism. Could we have picked a better person to ask to speak to us about post-Trump America? So with that, let me turn the mic over to Christopher.
Thank you, appreciate it, and I'm glad to be back with this group to present to you. What a 4 years it has been.
Excuse me, I want to suggest that we go to speaker view instead of gallery view. That way Chris will be large and we will be small.
Yeah, and I think each of you can do that individually.
We can't see him at all.
Oh, let's see if I come up, and then it helps if you have your microphones muted.
Everyone.
There we go. That helps with feedback and such. Perfect. All right. Yeah. So, and if you choose to go into speaker view, which you can do in the upper right corner where it says view, you can choose speaker view instead of gallery. That's okay. I unmuted myself. I get to play on Zoom all day these days, so I've gotten really used to what needs to be done. I have learned, by the way, if you'd like a little tip, that if you have to be on Zoom for longer, if you go over your own picture of yourself, there's the little 3 dots. And if you click on it, you can now hide self view, and then you don't have to see yourself. And I really like that because it works better for me to not have to see myself moving as I'm speaking and things like that. So just as I was saying, it's been quite a 4 years. It has felt more like 10, 15, I don't know, I've aged a lot in that time. I saw a comment last night from, I think it was a lawyer, a law professor, who was saying, it's odd being able to go to bed tonight and not expect to wake up to a crisis in the morning, which has been the reality of the lives of those of us who follow this closely. This also presented a very difficult topic for me to prepare to talk about. There are so many things, so many moving parts and pieces, and so many questions. I will say that on January 7th, I spent 45 minutes in my classes just opening up to questions for students to ask, because there's just a lot to figure out and make sense of. So I tried to come up with something that would kind of leave me room. I waited to do the final preparation of this till yesterday, just to be like, okay, what are we waiting for? Where are we at? So there are things that are still going on that I'm not going to end up really touching on in my talk, but I'm going to try to leave room for a fair amount of questions, and they can be about a broad range of subjects. I'm not going to talk about the impeachment trial, for example, or the current battle over power sharing in the Senate. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on still. I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability on those topics, but I'm trying to put something together for this. I came up with a title for this talk back in December, Post-Trump America, Where Does American Politics Go From Here, which feels like years ago, right? I mean, whoa, back in December. Oh gosh, that was so long ago. So much has changed. And in fact, I think that path of like, where does American politics go from here has itself changed from what I would have said in December in ways that I'll try to highlight and emphasize. So where are we in this moment? Where are we right now? Look, Joe Biden has been lawfully inaugurated as the new president of the United States. His election was certified by the states and by Congress with no evidence of fraud that would in any way have affected the results. The Democrats control the House by a small margin, and the Senate is tied 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, with Vice President Harris casting the deciding tie-breaking vote. But we also have some portion of the American public who reject at least some of these basic facts. And that rejection is inescapably connected to President Trump's refusal to acknowledge his own electoral defeat. This culminated most visibly in the violent assault on the Capitol building on January 6th. Those are facts as well, and they are ones that merit serious attention if we think about the state of politics in the United States right now. There is no question that polarization is at historically high levels in the United States. That polarization is not purely ideological, but it's also connected to individual identity, what we call affective polarization. In other words, I don't just disagree with you, I don't like you. Right? It's not just, oh, you're on the other side of the aisle, we have disagreement, but I don't like you. I don't value you. I don't think you are a good person because of your positions. And I express my group membership through various displays, be it clothing or car purchases, or even where I decide to live. That all of these are parts of this affective polarization. Now, this polarization started out asymmetrically, which means that the Republican Party, particularly elected elites, shifted to the right significantly. And it was asymmetric. And we can track this through data. There was an asymmetric shift. In the decades since this trend began, Democrats have also shifted to the left, although far less than the Republican Party has shifted to the right. This isn't new, and it was visible in American politics well before Trump was elected to office. So this polarization is not new. It's not something that just popped up because of President Trump. However, Trump's time in office exacerbated and accelerated these trends substantially, especially affective polarization. This was amplified by the choices of social media companies and the actions and reporting of major media outlets. Right? It's profitable for these entities to encourage engagement, and we're much more engaged when we are upset. So it helps for us to be upset. And so we get this set of information and what comes out that amplifies that. I'm upset, I'm outraged. If I'm outraged, I'm tuning in, I'm watching, I'm paying attention, I'm retweeting, I'm doing these things. Again, not new. Nothing about that is new. That's not unique to the Trump presidency. It's not distinctive, but it's something that became particularly visible over the past 4 years. Truth became secondary to saying things that felt right. And this too is asymmetric, but definitely not exclusively the domain of the right. Plenty of examples of wishful thinking and analysis disconnected from reality on the left. but it's misleading to treat this as sort of a, well, both sides, there's good people on both sides sort of thing, because it was and is asymmetric for reasons grounded in who the parties are and how they perceive themselves. So that is present. Now, the election outcome in November was the result of massive organization and heightened attention. Estimated turnout of the voting eligible population was 66.7%, which is the highest turnout in 120 years. Now, you might think 66.7%, we're not close to full participation, and that is quite true. We're not, we never have been, but again, the highest since 1900 is not something to turn your nose up at, right? This is high levels of participation. And this happened despite a pandemic, right? And limited efforts by some state officials to make accommodations for those conditions. People wanted to be heard. And that's a good thing from the perspective of democracy. Participation is good for democracy. You want people to view elections as a mechanism by which they can express those preferences. Here's what I want, here's what I believe, here's what I favor. You want elections to be the means by which that is communicated. But there's a flip side to that as well. Democracy is defined most simply. I surprisingly just came across this definition relatively recently, but I love it for its simplicity and accuracy. Democracy are systems where parties lose elections. That's simple. It's systems where parties lose elections. There has to be a chance, and it has to happen, where parties lose elections. If you have a party that never loses an election, you're probably not in a democracy, right? So they have to lose. They have to lose sometimes. And that means being willing to accept the outcomes of elections that are not what you personally would want. And that is an area where the United States struggled, led most visibly by President Trump himself. We absolutely have struggled with that. The attack on Congress on January 6th embodied this dynamic in a particularly ugly and brutal fashion. Thousands of people gathered at the behest of the losing candidate to try to prevent the certification of the election winner. Threats of violence against Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi were widespread and encouraged by the president's rhetoric. After all, if the election has been stolen, shouldn't you fight for it? I mean, doesn't that justify extreme measures? Massive fraud and corruption demand action. This would, of course, be a very different talk if there actually was massive fraud and corruption. That too is corrosive to democracy and incompatible with parties losing elections, and we need to be just as critical of massive fraud and corruption as we are of failing to accept the outcome of an election. What stands out about the present moment, though, is that there was not massive fraud and corruption. Excuse me. Our election system is very decentralized, and there are multiple layers of checks in place that makes it very difficult to rig a national election. Now, that hasn't always been true in American history, but it is very much true and has been true for a long time in the United States. Believing that there was fraud in the 2020 election requires believing that fraud was carried out only to benefit Joe Biden and not a single one of the Democratic candidates for either the House or the Senate that would have made it easier for Joe Biden to enact his preferred agenda. The claim falls apart upon the most cursory inspection, and these claims have been inspected far more than cursorily. I mean, these have been looked at in great depth. One of the things I spent a lot of time doing over the last couple months is following the court cases that were filed, looking at the evidence that was presented, and there wasn't anything that stood up to actual interrogation of the evidence, right? It didn't hold. There is no evidence and has not been any evidence of fraud or corruption that changed the outcome of the election. Yet a distressingly high number of Americans believe that there was fraud, despite the evidence. Over 100 members of the House and 6 senators were willing to take that claim seriously enough that they challenged the certification of the electoral votes from some states that Joe Biden won. This leaves a clear specter that a closer election, one that Biden did not win as decisively, could and perhaps would have been overturned by those in power to protect themselves. This is not the sign of a healthy democracy, right? That's a sobering thought, that could have been the outcome of the 2020 election. It is an indication of a system with serious problems and flaws that need to be addressed in order to continue functioning. Democracy in the United States is more fragile than many thought. However, I want to pull back a little bit to put in what I think is a more helpful perspective. The attack on the Capitol and all the rage and fury were ultimately pretty pathetic. And I use that word intentionally. It was pathetic. The numbers of people who were there were dwarfed by the numbers of people who were protesting this summer, or the number of people who came out and protested after President Trump's inauguration. Absolutely dwarfed by those numbers. We're talking about low thousands. We're not talking about tens, hundreds of thousands. We're talking about a pretty small number. The shutting down of social media outlets for those voices quickly demonstrated that this was not a mass movement, but a small, though dangerous, group of individuals committed to a fundamentally anti-democratic view of the United States. The amplification of their voices, perhaps assisted by other countries and manipulation of algorithms, made it seem like a larger group than it really was. Their success in storming the Capitol was much more a function of law enforcement not taking their threat seriously, connected in important ways to racialized perceptions of threats, than any overwhelming movement. Once in the Capitol building, most of them just milled around and took selfies. And it was a movement that was doomed from the start, in no small part because of the sizable lead that Biden held in both the popular vote and the electoral votes. Does anyone imagine that even the most horrifying potential circumstances, taking members of Congress hostage, even executing some of them, that those outcomes would in any way have resulted in President Trump staying in office? This was theater, although no less deadly because it was theater. there was no chance, given the outcome of the election and the, the sort of margin of victory, of this changing. President Trump attempted to hold on to power despite losing his election and utterly failed. What should distress us is that we elected someone with so little regard for democracy in the first place. And once in that position, he used his resources and a willing set of media outlets to advance blatantly false claims, not only about the election, but about almost every policy proposal the administration advanced. Remember how he kept promising his healthcare plan in 2 weeks. It's amazing. It's amazing. We're going to have it out in a couple weeks. That never arrived. We never got a healthcare plan. In the 4 years of his presidency, not once was there a healthcare plan that came out. Indeed, one highlight of the Trump presidency is just how little actual policymaking got done. Because President Trump was not well equipped to negotiate with Congress, he did not understand how to get things passed into law. He instead relied on things like executive orders, which, as we saw yesterday, President Biden undid with a signature. What had been sort of the major towering achievements allegedly of the Trump administration were undone in a day. Muslim ban, gone. Building the wall, done. The repeal of DACA, put back in place. Right? On issue after issue after issue. Reduction of environmental protections, changed. So we're back into the Paris Climate Accord. We're back into the World Health Authority, World Health Organization, sorry. So, again and again and again, these sort of policy achievements end up being pretty minimal in character. But let's set that aside for the moment, because I think it's very important to look ahead about what this all might mean for the future. Will Biden be able to govern? What will Congress do? What will Trump do now that he is out of office? How will the public that believed his lies about the election move forward? Right, these are hard questions. And there are not easy answers to them. So if you're looking to me, okay, good, I'll get this down and I'll just write it down. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to provide that for you. But I'm going to make an effort to shed some light on them and I think on some dynamics that are really important to pay attention to with this. First, we are going to continue having affective polarization. The election has not ended that. This means we are going to continue to see people perceiving the other as less than human or as evil. And that is bad for trying to reach compromise within a democratic system. One doesn't compromise with pure evil, right? And that makes it very difficult to govern as long as that attitude and view has prevalence. The media environment will continue to permit a disconnection from a shared reality. This is, again, a significant problem for trying to gather support for policies or compromise to get policies passed. If one group of citizens lives in a world where massive fraud has occurred and the other set of citizens lives in a world where it has not, it's going to be very difficult to find common ground. Those who were convinced that the election outcome was the result of massive fraud are not going to let that go, and they will treat the Biden administration accordingly. Right-wing extremist violence is not going to go away. It remains, as it has been for several decades, a serious threat to the safety of the American people. You all remember the Oklahoma City bombing, and that hasn't gone away. Trump will continue to garner attention and followers. Although the loss of Twitter is going to negatively affect his ability to remain at the front of his supporters' minds, I suspect that Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax will do their best to make sure that he gets plenty of coverage in the meantime. He's not going away. He's going to remain a visible figure. The Republican Party as a whole right now does not have sufficient electoral incentive to embrace majoritarian democracy nationally. That's a pretty serious problem. Some Republican elected officials are even calling for more restrictive voting rights, acknowledging at times openly that they would not win nationally without these restrictive rules. At the same time, their own seats are usually very safe. And the biggest concern is a primary challenge from the right. This leads them to focus on the concerns of the most extreme constituents, contributing to polarization overall. This is a bad situation for democracy on the whole. Parties should seek to adjust their positions over time to align with the majority of voters. Instead, counter-majoritarian elements of our political system diminish this incentive. I'll come back to that in a moment, but those counter-majoritarian elements of the political system are an important thing to pay attention to. Not all is doom and gloom here, though. That's all pretty dark, right? Those are bad things. It's not what you want to hear about your democracy or your country. But I think it's important to remember some things. One is that people change their minds, even about their beliefs. If we look at polls of Republican respondents, for example, we might look at that and say, oh my gosh, 40 some odd % of Republicans think that there was fraud and Biden doesn't deserve to be elected, and how can we function and what's going on, and oh my gosh. But we really need to be careful not to take polls as fixed. Polls capture a set of views at a moment in time. But time doesn't stop. Time keeps moving on, and those views can shift. I think a useful analogy here is to the polls regarding people's willingness to get vaccinated for COVID. If we look at those initial numbers, like, oh my gosh, shockingly large numbers of people say, no, I don't know if I'm going to get vaccinated. But then when we look at the actual efforts to get vaccines, there's not enough vaccines for all the demand, right? People want this. People are going to change. These aren't fixed, and people might give an answer to a poll question at one moment in time that doesn't always accurately capture the full range of views that that person has. So we need to be careful not to read too much into them. It doesn't mean the problem's going away, but it may not be as severe as it looks when we first glance at it. The attack on the Capitol building did not play well with the public at large. Right? It did not sit well, even with many Republican supporters. We've seen some evidence of Republicans moving away from the party as it embraces these attacks. Will that carry over into the 2022 midterms? That very much remains to be seen. How lasting are these shifts? Part of that story will depend on whether Trump carries through with his promise to start another party, the Patriot Party. Splits like that within the Republican Party would have serious negative consequences for short-term electoral success of the Republican Party. We have an electoral system that's first past the post, or winner take all. So if you have a set of voters and you split them and the other party doesn't split their voters, they're going to end up winning. They're going to get more votes than those two split parties. And such a development might create the circumstances necessary to bring the Republican Party's actions back in alignment with pursuing majoritarian democracy, which would be a very good thing, a very good outcome to have. Having a single party in any system is not good. Having more than one party is a really important feature of functional democracies. What are the things that are going to help with that? First, establishing robust protections for voting rights in all states is going to be important. This is incidentally going to disadvantage Democrats in some jurisdictions and Republicans in others. Good, as it should, right? New York is one of the worst states for voting rights, and that needs to get cleaned up. It should not be that way. And having that focus be nationwide, not just on the former states of the Confederacy or states that had adopted Jim Crow legislation, is really important to ensuring continued participation and access to voting. That will get a more accurate picture of what the American public actually wants. There will always be some gaming of the electoral system that is unavoidable, but the more that we can minimize it, the better. So HR 1 and S1, so House Resolution 1 and Senate Bill 1, are good first steps towards accomplishing this. These bills have already been put forward that would offer some additional protections in this. We also need to address the difficulties of majority governance within our political system. The more that minority parties can act to block the policy goals of majority parties without visibility to voters, the harder it is for voters to make informed voting decisions. Barriers like the filibuster have long had negative effects on the overall democratic, lowercase d, democratic efficacy of our system. And lest you think that I'm just saying this now that Democrats have a majority in Congress, I assure you I've been saying this for a couple of decades, regardless of who is in control. It's a bad thing that the majority party isn't able to enact their agenda, because then voters don't know whether they agree with the policy preferences of those parties. We want to have visibility for voters of what it means to have a Democratic majority. What does it mean to have a Republican majority? And so to the extent that we can increase the majoritarian nature of governance, that's not abandoning the protection of rights, but to allow majority parties to enact their policy preferences. Things, by the way, like allowing presidents to nominate the people that they want to run their own agencies with, some check to make sure they're qualified, but not, well, I don't like what positions they're going to adopt, and so I'm going to block that. That has pretty serious negative consequences on the ability of majority parties to enact their preferences. We enter into an uncertain time, right? The challenges and problems are real, and they're not just connected to the person of Donald Trump. It's very important to recognize that though President Trump is no longer in office, the issues within our political system that he represented are not going away. But that doesn't mean that they are unchangeable, that these problems are inescapable and unavoidable. These are problems that can be solved, albeit slowly and at times painfully. Predicting the future is always a dicey proposition, so I'm hesitant to offer my guesses. I'm as wrong as often as I'm right. But I think our odds are better of making it through with a functioning democracy if we are at least clear-eyed about what the problems are, because then we can start having open and direct conversations about possible solutions. That's what I have to present to you. And I would welcome any and all questions that you have. Again, it can be about the specific things I talked about or about other general things relating to the state of politics at the moment. I didn't even talk about the Supreme Court, and that's what I study and teach. So any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer.
Chris, this is Tony Lineweber with a hand raise.
Yeah.
Fact checking, truth versus untruth. How do you view any attempts to regulate that in a free society?
Yeah. That's a great question. It is an area where there's a lot of research that's been going on of what's effective and what's not effective, right? What changes people's views and what doesn't. There's a political scientist, Brendan Nyhan, who's at Dartmouth, he's done some of this work and he promotes a lot of this work in his own Twitter feed. If you're curious about some of the details, it ends up being just a pretty nuanced picture, right? That we can't just say, oh yeah, we just need to, shut it down and government needs to not allow this, or government even needs to get involved. But what are the steps by which, for example, social media companies make decisions about what is allowed, what their terms of services are, and when that's violated, how they deal with things that aren't true. And one of the things is you can help reduce, this was actually something that Twitter did eventually, which is they would make tweets that met certain characteristics, ones that couldn't be retweeted. And that reduces the spread of that misinformation. So someone else could repeat it if they chose to, and they could write it separately, but the sort of viral spread that retweeting would allow can get cut down. So there are things like that, but that's very difficult to legislate or mandate. Yeah, I think that's, I don't have a great answer to it, but I will say that there's a lot of work being done to try to develop evidence-based answers to guide us through those difficult questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's Helen Youngles and Neil. Do you think it's important to have the impeachment to show that using misinformation, especially about an election, does not pay for a leader?
Good question. So yeah, and as I said, I didn't end up talking about impeachment at all, despite the fact like this is huge. But yes, do I think that that's important? Absolutely, I do. I think that one feature that has been frustrating for a broad swath of Americans across ideological beliefs is a perception of a lack of accountability for those who they believe are doing wrong. And I think that that's not new either, right? In American politics, this is not the only time where we've not held individuals accountable. But I do think that embracing that as an American value to be pursued is important. And I think that the impeachment can be an element of that. That you don't get to just do and say whatever you want just because you're elected. I think that, seeing members of Congress go around the metal detectors to get into the chamber, or refusing to wear masks in the chamber, or even more horrifically, while sheltering in place with so many other members of Congress, that resulted in at least 3 members of Congress testing positive for COVID, are things that need to have accountability. This is not the behavior of individuals who are interested or willing in participating in a collective society, right? When we can disagree, we don't have to share the same values even, but we have to at least treat one another as decent and worthy of attention and care. And I think that you know, you have to signal that in some way, that that's an important value. And I think one of the ways in which you signal that is through accountability for those who have power when they misuse that power, as President Trump misused his power.
Tony?
Oh, I saw Pat had a question in the chat, which I'll answer, and then
fine.
I'll come to this other one. Comparing Oregon's Republican representatives walking out to Congress's filibuster, I would put them right in the same boat. I think that those kinds of actions, and I would add to that the Texas Democrats walking out in the Texas state legislature in 2004, somewhere around there, to block redistricting, was also problematic, although their walking out was to block itself a violation of norms and informal institutions about when we redistrict. That was a mid-census redistricting put in place by the Texas Republican legislature to get more Republican representatives in Congress after they had already redistricted after the 2000 census. But I do think that those kinds of actions do block the ability of majority parties to govern, and to the extent that they occur are problematic because they prevent parties. So think about how many voters were frustrated with Oregon Democrats because they didn't enact climate legislation. The Democrats tried. A majority of Democrats were on board. There were plenty of votes there to make that happen, but that was blocked through procedural barriers. And I think that those kinds of things are erosive of democratic accountability and effectiveness. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent program. And I'm glad it's recorded because my wife wanted to hear it, but she had a conflict. So great parts of technology.
Yes.
Now, in relation to the appointment of federal judges, which I think in most cases, the filibuster isn't, you know, one party eliminated it for.
Yep. Yeah. It's entirely gone now. Yep.
Relating, so we have that given, relating your excellent description of the asymmetry of the two parties, you know, one going a little farther out than the other. How do we, that presents a little bit of a dilemma for me because I don't feel like we're having small d democratic. How would you, if you could fix it, what would you do?
When I am benevolent dictator, things will run very differently.
Yeah. Right.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is a serious problem, and a lot of the responses come down to talking about what are democracy reinforcing behaviors and actions, and even rhetoric, right? So the way we talk about problems and how we should solve them, that we want to be careful to do that in a way that even rhetorically, as well as obviously substantively, reinforces democracy as a worthy value, as a shared value within our community. So when we talk about you know, asymmetrical polarization and we can even talk about sort of partisan sorting that's happened, when we talk about that, we want to still emphasize, look, polarization itself is not an inherent bad. Affective polarization is a much more troubling dynamic, but polarization itself just means like people feel strongly about the party that they care about and the views that they hold, and they participate more when polarized. So actually that can be democracy reinforcing. But when that polarization happens within our political system that is not designed to handle polarization well, we have so many veto points that can prevent policy from being enacted, that it's very easy for polarization to result in extensive gridlock and difficulty in enacting policies. What we get in practice has been a burst of policy enactments in the first 2 years of a president's term, and then nothing for the remaining 6, right? Or very little for the remaining 6. So, I mean, the idea that, well, I'm afraid to give up the filibuster because I don't want, I'm worried that there are extremists in the other party and they're going to push things, ends up having a negative overall consequence for how we perceive democracy. I need to burn the village down in order to save it.
Yeah.
Right. And so to the extent that we can, I think it's important that we embrace policies, even those that might lead to outcomes that are less favorable to your own preferences, as long as those are reinforcing the values, the underlying values of democracy. I think that President Trump should have been able to nominate and appoint the judges that he wanted to nominate and appoint. And as long as they were qualified, which was an issue in some instances, then I think that those individuals should be seated on the bench. I may disagree with the positions that some of them would take, but I think that that is one of the benefits of pointing out that there are consequences of elections. And if you don't like that, then vote differently so that you get different outcomes, which is why we want a connection between the policy outputs and the voting inputs. We want those to be connected. I saw Mitch McConnell today was talking about, look, respect for the minority party in the Senate is a longstanding tradition. We need to make sure, I don't know why you're not, going along with this. Of course, Mitch McConnell in 2016 said, winners make policy, losers go home. Right. So there's something of you do look for some sincerity in those claims. There needs to be something genuine. But to the extent that we can, we want that democracy reinforcing language to come out. All right, next question. I see Diane had a question in the chat about winner take all versus popular vote of the entire country. I mean, the electoral college system is and has always been a disaster in the United States. It has never operated as the framers of the Constitution intended it to. And many of those who adopted the electoral college never imagined that someone would vote for a candidate from another state, and therefore no one would ever get a majority of electoral votes, and the House of Representatives would always decide the president. They didn't imagine political parties as a thing. And so it's particularly ill-suited to the existence of political parties. The Electoral College has had many negative effects on American politics, and I think it's negatively affected those who talk about it, protecting it most importantly. The idea of small states are advantaged under the Electoral College is simply not true. How many times did presidents visit Connecticut? Right, unless it was to raise money. They weren't there to get those electoral votes. And it wasn't, oh, well, they're just focusing on the big states, because they didn't go to Texas or California or New York either, right? Because, well, we already knew who those states were going to vote for. So it instead privileges a small number of unusual states in ways that are potentially problematic. I mean, I pointed out to my students in the fall, I said, there's not a single poll out there that shows Joe Biden losing the popular vote by any close margin. And indeed, Joe Biden won the popular vote by significant margins. But a 0.5% of a change in where those votes were distributed would have resulted in President Trump winning the election. That's a problem, right? That's a disconnection between the preferences of the people and the outcomes that we get. And I think that again, is undermining the value of democracy in the public's mind. And that leads to these kinds of responses that are themselves quite anti-democratic.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think about seeking bipartisan solutions?
I think that bipartisan solutions can be fine when we're in a position that, I think compromise is central to an important part of politics. I think that no matter what, you have to engage in compromise in order to actually enact policies. I think that the idea of bipartisan solutions achieved a sort of exalted role and position in our discussion of politics that I don't think it deserves. I think that what we want is we want majority positions that compromise. And I think we don't necessarily want the majority party to simply trod over the minority party's views. Or if they do, we should have a political system where the minority party has the opportunity to vote and convince others to support their positions and get the majority party no longer being the majority party. So, I mean, I think bipartisanship is fine as far as it goes, but I don't think it's a value in and of itself. I think compromise is the value that matters here. Compromise with people who aren't willing to compromise is not a useful strategy. So I would sort of put that in that, like, we talk about bipartisanship, and when we talk about that, we tend to be using that language in a reflection of the state of political parties in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And how those parties operate and what they look like has changed. So Southern Democrats are not Democrats anymore. They're Republicans. We talked about, it's easy to get bipartisans because you could get Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans would vote together, and you had crossing party lines. But that's because of how the parties were split, and they're split differently now, such that talking about bipartisanship as a value in and of itself, I think, is less beneficial.
Richard has a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
What amazes me is that how the truth is kind of out the door. We, as Americans, we learn about truth in school, in church. That's our whole life. And the last 4 years have been untruth. It's like the East Coast is going to fall into the Atlantic Ocean, or the sun will go out tomorrow. How have we accepted lies and untruth in our system, and no one is outraged by it? I'm outraged. I really am.
Yeah.
No one, and even the congressional people are not outraged. They're participating in it. How do you stop that?
Right.
It's not an easy thing to do, but I'm just amazed that people have accepted that as a daily routine thing, that whatever someone says is true. I mean, it makes no sense to me. And I'm very upset about it.
Yeah, I mean, this absolutely is an ongoing and very serious challenge in terms of how we operate. I might characterize things a little bit differently. I think there are different groups and that means that there's different solutions, if you will, to this.
Well, the president's the main teller of lies.
Yeah. But in terms of who's listening to it and who's believing, there are people who believe the lies, right? So,
well, that's beside the point. I'm saying truth is not being pushed. And why aren't we more outraged?
Yes. I mean, some people are outraged by that. But I think that there are a couple of things. You have people who will cynically take advantage of that because they know that it will be electorally beneficial to them to lie. Now, politicians have always taken advantage of that. And politicians, there's a long history of politicians not being completely forthright.
But people like the sun will go out tomorrow. I mean, that's pretty certain it's not going to happen. I mean,
right.
We've
had a level of lies that have exceeded past experience. But I think here you have an information ecosystem. You have an information environment that is different. And we've had partisan press before. That's not new. In fact, most of our history is partisan presses. But the interconnection of those, I think, allows that to allows groups to spread. You might have gotten your local paper in Ohio, and it might have been the Democratic paper. And so you only read what the Democratic Party leaders wanted you to read. And that was the only news you had. And they may have been lies, may have been filled with lies, but you didn't know that. And you didn't really interact with a whole lot of other people who were clashing over that. And you didn't get that reinforced because you didn't have the same ease of communication with someone who was living in South Carolina or who was living in New Mexico. And so, but that ease of communication is present now, so that you have, in addition to kind of silos of information, which will reinforce the untruths. You have those groups both spreading and reinforcing within themselves, and then hammering up against others in ways that actually serve to reinforce their own beliefs. So that they come at it with, as we all do, right? There are these biases that we have. They come at those interactions.
These are not shades of gray. These are like the sun will go out. I mean, these are totally wrong, verifiable. And
Yeah.
why hasn't someone, I hear what you're saying, but I don't buy it at
But
all.
they have, right? I mean, so there's plenty of reporting on President Trump's lies, to use one set of examples, right? There's plenty of reporting on that. It was extensively reported, but it was reported in some outlets and not in others. So if you follow, Daniel Dale and his insane work trying to keep up with every lie that the president issued, then you would know, like, well, that's simply not true. But if you didn't follow that, if you instead had a different set of news sources, then you wouldn't get that challenge. You wouldn't have someone say, oh, well, that's a lie. You just and then you sort of forget about the things that are lies. And you move on because you have a wish. And this is true of all of us, regardless of ideology. We want to believe the things we already believe, right? Confirmation bias is real and it is strong. And so if I'm given a story that I want to believe in, and I get information that's inconsistent with that story, I am going to discount its accuracy and validity. And that's just part of who we are as human beings, our cognition. So it gets called out. It's not that you can't find examples and clear documentation of the lies. It's getting people to accept those in contravention of
80
their
million
narrative.
people in school. It's a culture. The kids in school are all getting the same lies. We're training kids to lie is the way to get ahead.
I was going to ask, Chris, do you think that social media has come into play because, I've seen documentaries where you're getting fed, like if you're looking at certain things and you're only getting fed that information, and that has led to why people believe all of these things.
Yes, I do think that there are elements of that. I do think that, and there's actually good evidence of this. There's a really good book that broke down the 2016 election and lies in the 2016 election and tracked through how did they spread, right? And what were the means? They used network analysis and went through, okay, where did this come from and how did it get out there? And I think that absolutely plays a role. Things like YouTube's algorithm in terms of what videos you're going to see next, especially during a pandemic, I think led to an increased acceptance of things like QAnon, which is, just so clearly deranged that it still gets acceptance. But I also think that there's a decrease in trust in authorities that provide information. And that's not a new thing. That's been a long-term effort to undermine the trust in those institutions. And if I don't, they're saying this, but I don't trust what well, this was reported in the New York Times. I don't trust what the New York Times says, right? And if you don't trust it, then you might be open to another set of information and arguments out. Well, why not? Why can't this be true? So I don't think it's that we're teaching our kids to lie and lie to get ahead. I think that we have some pretty serious problems with regards to how we get and how we process information. Yeah. I don't think that people today are more prone to lying inherently than in the past. I think that we see it emerging in ways that are distinctive because of the particular information ecosystem that we operate in.
Chris, hi, this is Steve. I am one of the co-presidents. I don't know how much time you've got, but to kind of finish up around 1 o'clock, there's a couple of questions that showed up in the chat. If you would maybe address those briefly.
Sure, yes, I will. I'll do my best on that. The first, would I counsel President Biden to attempt to add seats to the Supreme Court? Now we get into my fun territory of courts, right? I love this. Yes, if politically possible, I think that would be a good thing. Indeed, I would encourage increasing the size of the federal judiciary across the board. That's not just so Biden can appoint people. I'd be fine with that being time staggered across presidential terms. But the federal judiciary is simply too small for the caseload that it handles. So we've seen the rise of magistrate judges and bankruptcy judges and a whole lot of what are called Article I judges filling in for Article III judges, because the Article III judges themselves can't handle all the work that they're processing. So I think that there is value there. I also think that an even number of justices on the Supreme Court would be a desirable thing, so that if you wanted to make a change, you have to win over more than just one swing justice, that you would need to have multiple justices. I'm a fan of term limits, 18-year terms staggered so that every president gets to make an appointment per term. You get 2 terms, you get to make more appointments. That's fine, but President Carter got 0 appointments. President Ford got 1. President Ford didn't even finish a complete term. President Nixon had 4 before him. So that's over the course of 3 presidential terms. 5 justices got replaced, and then none, and then Reagan got to replace 3 more. So that kind of uneven appointment, I think, is problematic. So I'm very open to. In fact, this is another thing I've been talking about for a very long time, encouraging a change to how we think about Supreme Court justices serving, allow them to go into senior status, as we do with all the federal judges at the lower courts. Once they reach a certain age or time of service, they go to senior status and they can hear cases, but you add a new justice. I think there are a lot of ways to go about that. And so I think that having a conversation about that is actually really important. And I think it's a moment where we might actually be able to have that. And then the possibilities of the Electoral College being changed due to the different campaign policies that would change. Yeah, there'd be no swing states. One argument for a long time for the Electoral College is it allows candidates who don't raise a lot of money to just focus on Iowa and New Hampshire, which are comparatively much less expensive than California and Texas and New York. And that's a theory, but it's a theory that hasn't been borne out by evidence, because what we see is ever increasing spending, right? We're spending over $1 billion on presidential campaigns. It's not like having the Electoral College has somehow kept spending down. So it absolutely would change the way that campaigns conducted themselves in ways that I think would be quite beneficial, because you'd need to now win over the most votes and try to get the most votes regardless of where those people lived. There were more Trump voters in California than there were in Wyoming. Right? But they got ignored completely, and ignored not only in campaigning, but frankly in policy outcomes and policies and federal benefits provided to the states. They were worse off because they happened to live in California than if they had happened to live in Idaho. And so I think that has created a set of disconnections in terms of political preferences.
Chris.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we all just were fascinated with the questions, the answers, and your talk. Even though you left out a whole set of things that we had questions about, that's just fine. Maybe we can, months down the road, have you come back and you can revisit your projection.
Sure. Yeah. Here are the 4 million other things that we couldn't talk about, but that are still obviously highly important and significant at this moment in time.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you for attending. I think this is our high water mark in terms of attendance for monthly.
Yeah, I saw 31 plus at least 3 couples, so that'd be 34.
Great. Yeah, that's good.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and my hope is, I put a wish out there for all other political scientists that we finally get to sleep at night and just get a little break from having like world-changing news every day. Like just maybe every week. I'd be okay with that. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you welcoming me in, and I'd be happy to talk with you all in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
A quick note.